on, you said that what ended up being the Shelburn Harbor incident in
Hmm.
1960 got tagged on to the end
Yes.
of the Shag Harbor incident. So, in other words, somehow they became conflated.
Yeah, they did because, at the time, like I say, I was about a year into my reinvestigation, and initially I had found and talked to the fishermen, to the reporters, had done a lot of research in Ottawa, had gone there physically and sat there and went through a lot of the paperwork. And, those were heady days. I was so excited. Like things happened very quickly. And as the document record demonstrated, it was quite clear the Canadian government believed that this was a genuine UFO incident, and most likely the penetration of our skies and defense systems by something extraterrestrial or extra dimensional, whatever, So, these were great things. And then suddenly, when I tried to find some of the divers, I got a list of all the 7 divers who had dove on the Shag Harbor incident. As I tracked them down, the man who first put it on to me, who at the time was in charge of the fleet diving unit at Maritime Command in Halifax, the first thing he said when I tracked him down and was asking who was there, he said, "Well, Chris," he goes, "you know about Shelburne, don't you?" And I said, "Well, gee, Shelburne, that's Shag Harbor's in Shelburne County. Is that what you mean?" And he laughed. He said, "Oh, no, 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 no." He says, "Shelburne," he said, "Shag Harbor was a UFO incident, but Shelburne," he goes, "there was no doubt." And, the other guys with him, they'd all nod and say, "No, no, no, there was no doubt of what was going on there." And I'd say, "Yeah, okay." And they go, "Well, when you talk to the guys at Dove, they'll tell you." And they gave me a list and said that a couple of the guys had dove on both incidents. They had long careers.
Okay.
So I started with them, and especially with the advice that one was more apt to talk than the rest. And when I made the contact, and I called right away, there would have been no time to prep him or whatever. The first thing he said is, "Oh, yeah, yeah." He goes, "You know about Shelburne, don't you?"
Mhm.
And same thing. So I arranged to meet face to face and go to the home. And this diver told me this incredible story that in Shelburne Harbor, and I would ask him about Shag Harbor and my understanding of it, and he would say, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that was a UFO incident." By the time we got there, it was all over, though. When the naval search began. But he said that wasn't the case in Shelburne. We got there, things were still going on. And I'm saying, "Well, is this the same time, the same year?" And he says, "Oh, no." The first guy says it was earlier. I couldn't tell you the year of the ships. He goes, "I think it was back around the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course was October 62.
Mhm.
But none of the others could even name a date generally or whatever." He tells me that they were down there on a training mission for minesweeping, hence the name of the mission. And that was the actual name of the NATO mission, Sweep Clear 5.
Ah,
So, and in those days, Canada still had a 60 ship navy, right? So we used to do a lot of NATO missions, right? In fact, we had a ship that was just geared up to be a floating command center for NATO missions, which was HMCS Cape Scott
mhm.
in Halifax, right? The Cape Scott was about 500 feet in length almost. It looked like a supply ship, but it was much more than that. It was a floating headquarters, a factory repair vessel, and had multiple roles, right? So, anyway, he was telling me this story, and he said, "Well, we were down there," as he put it, I think it was frigging around with some British influence mines they had developed, you know. They always had us trying some new stuff out. And he said, "We laid this course and we were about to go through it." And he said, "My God, we started that day. We're only an hour into the mission. And there we are. We come upon these 2 UFOs sitting on the seabed." And he said, "We're in shallow water." He said, "We weren't worried about decompression or anything." And he goes, "There's activity." And it was like pulling teeth at this point. And he said, I can't really go into it too much." I said, "What do you mean activity?" He goes, there were live aliens in the water around the craft."
Wow.
And yeah, so, he tells me the story, and it gets very reluctant to go into great detail, but, it had the ring to truth. And when I would push his buttons, Richard, you'd see the emotion. Now, divers like this, particularly somebody with a career, as a clearance diver in the Navy, they do a lot of nasty work. They sometimes have to haul their friends out of down Sea Kings or crash and mishaps. And, these guys, we talked shop when I first went to the home on that Good Friday for some length. And this guy and his colleagues, when they open up, it was like, it was emotional for them. And, I never forgot that. And it was one of the reasons I didn't dispense with the story. To be honest, I wasn't quite ready to go there. And I was very tough on myself all through the reinvestigation of Shag Harbor to come up with the paperwork, to come up with the proof, to investigate the alternate explanations. I was my own skeptic, and with Shelburne, it proved to be a much tougher nut to crack. And be honest, as the book demonstrates, for those who venture through it, it took me 29 years to convince me that this was a genuine incident, and that at that point I could name the ships, the date, and what played out.
You know about Canada's Roswell, the Shag Harbor UFO incident in 1967, but this is the Shelburne Harbor UFO incident. Sweep Clear 5. NATO's UFO encounter. Chris Stiles is with us with a foreword by Martin Willis. After that first diver opened up to you about seeing two craft in shallow water off of Shelburne Harbor and actual um, entities slash divers on the outside or underwater on the outside of these craft. Did he put you on to another diver that he was working with, for corroboration?
Yes, he did. And unfortunately, the next diver wasn't in the Halifax area, and it was a phone interview. I always prefer being face to face over phone, over keyboard, over whatever. The more intimate, the better. I often include in lectures like the value of that. You hear what's going on in the room, you see the reaction of a spouse or whatever, and it's all part of like doing a proper investigation. But yeah, he put me on to somebody else. And it was interesting because the other one eventually turned out to be a work colleague years later, and somebody who, I viewed with, you know, every bit of respect possible. And they told me essentially the same thing. And again, very reluctant witnesses, confirmed the details. And, but I still didn't know what to do with it because I thought, wow, what's the chance of getting any paperwork on this? The incredible thing is that the second witness that spoke to me in depth, now these are the men who were actually there. They were under the water when it happened, when first contact is made. you know, uh, he tells me that he actually filmed the event,
Wow.
on underwater, like old would have been
Super 8.
35 mil.
Okay.
Yeah.
35.
And of course, which leads to the obvious question, what happened to this film? Where did it go? And I'll tell you the level, Richard, the degree of answer I was getting is that the film, when a few days later they were sent ashore from the ship while the ship was still holding station over these USOs, by the way, and they drove it to Halifax to the Defense Research Board on the Dartmouth side. There's a little brick building, it's still there to this day, and they turned it over to Dr. Maurice Coffey and Jason Greenblatt at the Defense Research Board. And of course, being the Navy, you never hear back about it, right? I can remember the level of detail. They took it up in an old Army deuce and a half they used to call Old Sid, that was really kind of a cantankerous rig to drive and depend on, right? And they turned it over, and that's the last they ever hear about it, of course, right?
So the divers, they didn't give it to their superiors. I mean, were they attached to the HCMS Cape Scott or?
Yeah, they were actually, and that's significant too because in 1960 things were a little different in the Canadian Navy. Again, one more thing that different put the distance between 67 and 60. In 1960, divers would be assigned to ships, and most like Canadian naval ships would have had at least two that were stationed aboard, and diving was a trade then. You know, And the thing is, like, by 67, divers were just mostly pooled within the fleet diving unit and would be sent to whatever. But 1960, yeah, these guys were part of the ship. And, you know, but it was years before this unfolded because none of them wanted to name the ships. And,
I'm
you
just
know,
curious as to why they wouldn't have been required to give that film footage to their superior, their commanding officer aboard the Cape Scott, rather than take it directly to that building in Dartmouth.
well, I mean, it was brought up like I, I'd have to jump ahead because there were things. Okay, let's go there. We only have a certain amount of time. Here's the big surprise that I find now. None of the men claimed this at the time. They'd said that when they first encountered, of course, they're like, "What the?" They had that reaction, and when they're talking to the surface, and let them know at first up they're not believing what these guys are saying even for a minute. Once they realize it's true and confer with the sonar men and others, and they're saying, "Man, we're shooting the film footage, right?" They yank them out of the water. Everybody comes to the surface, and as they put it to me, all hell broke loose. And some of them used the term that we went to an emergency action station. Firearms were handed out as if we were being boarded. And you got to remember now, on this mission, Sweep Clarify, which again I never learned till 2022, it was a NATO mission. There were 10 U.S. warships involved and 8 Canadian, plus a diving tender that would have been the size of a tugboat. And, I can name all the ships because they were in Canadian waters within what was only a 12-mile limit then in outer Shelburn Harbor. They were under the command of the Cape Scott, whose captain was Commander Rankin at the time, Angus Rankin. The mission had been designed by Rear Admiral Kenneth Dyer, and he became kind of famous 2 years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's the Canadian admiral who went against Canadian orders and John Diefenbaker and took U.S. orders during the Cuban Missile Crisis directly and emptied the harbor in Halifax and went out and, like hunted down Soviet subs and, this kind of thing, right? That's a whole other story, although it's touched in the book. Unfortunately, I never got to interview Angus Rankin. He had been passed by the time I knew his role, but I had spoken to other admirals about this, including William Landymore, about this case, right? As it would surface. But here's the thing. Here's the amazing thing. Here's the first shock I got was in 2022, when the case opens up to me, and this is all the result of a dream, by the way, it explains in the book, that causes me to look up something on Wikipedia, and one sentence changed everything. And I had spent years going through archives trying to find the date by accident using little clues that I would gain along the way. So much wasted effort at 40 cents a page from Ottawa often.
Mhm.
But what happened was when I get in my hands in 2022 the actual ship's log for October of 1960, I follow the mission assembling down there. The ships, they all get lined up. And one of the first things they had to do, the Americans had gone down days before and laid a dummy minefield. And it was an 8-mile dog-leg course out at the entrance to Shelburn Harbor. And they begin in, and just like the diver had told me in 94. And by the way, when he tells me this story, it's 33 years old, the story,
Mm.
right? Really.
Yes.
At this point, it's 63 years old or whatever when I finally have the ship's logbook in my hand and I'm going through it, or a copy of it. And I get to, okay, the mission begins. It says entering swept channel. And he said about an hour in, all hell broke loose. I get to an hour and I'm reading this, and oh my God, there's so much jargon and naval thing because they're commanding 18 ships, right? There's all these communications. 60 minutes, nothing, and my heart's starting to sink a bit. Well, Richard, I get down to 90 minutes. We can allow them that discrepancy after all those years. I get to 90 minutes in, and suddenly I see something I never expected to see, and I've looked between Shag Harbor and other marine cases. I'm used to going through logs and entries, and what do I find? Assume DEFCON 1.
Yeah, you need to
1.
explain what that means.
Okay, in the DEFCON system, you have 5 levels of military readiness, right? Peacetime and everything at the lowest level would be 5. If you look up on Wikipedia or something more scholarly, right, you will find that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we were to nuclear war with the Soviet Union, we were at DEFCON 3 generally,
Mhm.
and DEFCON 2, for certain things, and that's the highest. It will tell you we've never been at DEFCON 1. This is not true. They're going to have to rewrite the history book here because this is not an internet rumor. This is in the ship's log. Assume DEFCON 1.
Wow.
DEFCON 1 is like you're ready, you're good to go. You
Yeah.
don't have to check with higher authority to deploy a weapon, to shoot, right?
One
Now,
second.
here's the
Right.
other thing. Like people say, well, Chris, why couldn't this have been a Soviet sub that gave challenge or come across the border? And there were lots of these stories, right? That it's a court martial offense not to record an enemy vessel near one of these operations. And in fact, in the book I got, it was right on the flap of the book when it has the rules for the navigation officer. You would not do that. You know what I mean? Like, and no enemy vessels are reported, in the area at the time, right? What's interesting is they have this encounter, they haul the men out of the water, they go to DEFCON 1, they lower lifeboats. And the men had told me that at the time they lowered lifeboats to put some debris in the boats that they'd picked up that they thought was foam and damage from one of the craft.
Yes.
And they hoist it up. They go to DEFCON 1. They don't stay at that level, they drop it a bit after that. The ships drop anchor. They're huddled together at the mouth of Shelburn Harbor, just past what's known as McNutt's Island. They're in 7 fathoms, 42 feet of water. Now, if this had been a Russian sub, you could have almost looked over the side and see the conning tower sticking up out, right?
Right.
They sit there for a week, well, 4 days, really. The men always used to say a week, but it turned out it was 4 days and never moved. Nobody lifts anchor or whatever, right? And the thing is, that whole time, I mean, it's, oh, time to get up.
We're already
Anyway,
awake. We're wide awake.
yeah, yeah. And this was a shock, and I checked so many things. At the time, I'm sure there's probably been some since. I could only find one internet rumor, and I did some searching of a declaration of DEFCON 1, and it was in West Germany back during the time of the wall, again in 1960.
Yes.
And radar detectors thought they had detected Russian bombers coming their way. But no one has ever proved it or found the paperwork a boy remembered from his father, and it just didn't hold water.
Well,
But here,
sorry, but
go ahead.
how did you, was this a simple access to information request to get the logs from the HCMS Cape Scott, or did you have to fly through hoops to get this thing?
Um, it was a simple request. However, remember, I didn't have the date or the names of the ships, right? And well, let me just tell this story of why I requested it at all. Because I had done years. In fact, I had written a chapter in a book that somebody else was going to publish about how I'd given up on the Shelburne story. I'm not known for giving up. I'm saying I admit, I believed what the men had told me. Should somebody walk in and drop it on my desk or give me that final clue, I would pursue it. But I'm done sitting in Ottawa or going. I cried uncle. Okay,
Hmm.
so and it was Christmas, between Christmas Day and New Year's in 2022, right? And I went to bed. I stayed up all night watching PVR's worth of UFO stuff I'd missed during the holidays, with relatives, friends, and people around. So I was ready to get into this. Mostly it was a rehash or follow ups of the Tic Tac stuff and whatever. And I was interested. That's all great stuff, too. I eventually got tired, went to bed, as I put it, surrendered to the sacred night, and I had a dream. And I dreamt that I was 5 years old and under an end table and listening to my father's friends. My father was the medic on HMCS Cape Scott. He had never told me anything of the Shelburne mission or whatever. And I dreamt it and I woke up and I didn't trust the dream or whatever. The only thing it caused me to do, Richard, was I went to the computer, opened it up, went to Wikipedia, because I was trying to wonder what is the classification of the Cape Scott. I knew Dad was on it. I knew it was, a supply ship, but it was more than that. I read up on it. When I get to the service history of the ship, the last sentence says, in 1960, HMCS Cape Scott took part in a NATO mission called Sweep Clear 5 in Shelburne Harbor, period. That's all it says. Well, all the years of searching and all the logs, I had never was able to put any Canadian warship in Shelburne Harbor during the Cold War. So, except for a 1 day visit, which was planned announced weeks before by the Fraser in 67 to show off our new invention, the bear trap, which allows them to land helicopters on the deck, and they were going to go to Washington to show it off to the Americans. So I saw that and I thought, oh my God, that's got to be it. And I was like, don't get too excited. It was the holidays. The next day I went to a used bookstore and went through old military magazines, figuring it would take a couple of months to have any bragging rights or coverage. The Navy used to have a magazine called The Crow's Nest. I found a copy from December 1960. Ironically, had the bounty on the cover because they were making the movie with Marlon Brando.
Right.
Anyway, I read, and here was coverage of Sweep Clear 5. It named all the ships, Canadian and American, involved in the mission, what the mission was supposed to be about, said who was the admiral that designed the mission at Maritime Command, which was Ken Dyer, who was in charge, et cetera, right? And when you read it, it was like one of those typical naval articles. Oh, and a good time was had by all. No life like it, right? So I had that, and I thought, well, I got to put in these requests. The first thing, though, was I went back to the computer because I had ships' names, right? And I started looking them up. And the first thing I found was you read the Canadian thing, a good time was had by all. I go to the American version. Well, there was nothing under Sweep Clear 5. But when I look at the service history of ships like USS Yazoo, which was part of the mission, I look at the Yazoo and it says that on October 15th, a few days afterwards, HMCS Cape Scott had to be rescued by USS Yazoo, which had complete engine failure and was drifting and going to ground on the shore of Shelburne Harbor. And at the last minute, she had been ordered with all ships to leave the harbor immediately. And it had to go back and tow the Cape Scott to safe anchorage. So that and on and on and on, there was these discrepancies. So I thought, wow, I got to go right to the source. The first thing I found was that when I tried to request, I wanted one of the ships that had been a diving tender, but supposedly its log hadn't been preserved. The diving tender's log, the YTM-8, hadn't been preserved, and it wasn't looking good. So I thought, well, let's go right for the command ship. And they did have Cape Scott. It took 7 months to get it beyond the act. And I've had some experience with that. I only had that happen once before, but when it came and I started to sift through it, lo and behold, there it was. And my first reaction, of course, to back up a bit, when I saw the Wikipedia article, oh my God, my father was there, because I knew he was posted on the boat in those early years. Wow. DEFCON 1, Dad was there,
Oh my Lord.
And then I got the thing, and things went a little quicker from there. But there's a lot to do yet on this case. But, after 29 years, I had to get a book out. I'm just like, oh my God, it was like a weight off my shoulder, Richard. It was a vendetta. It was a quest.